Hello guys, my name is Gavin O'Donnell and welcome to this ImagineFX workshop. Today I'll be taking you through how I break down a master painting in Procreate. I've chosen an image from one of my favourite artists, N.C. Wyatt. So studying the masters is a fantastic way of improving your skills. It doesn't matter if you're an amateur artist just starting out or you've been working professionally for a long time. There's always something new to learn from the masters. So these should never be overlooked. So in the first step, I'm just going to do a very rough sketch just to block in the general shapes of the composition and the general placement of the objects. Following this, I'm going to do a 4-value structure study. So I'm going, on my slider in Procreate, I'm going to choose a 10%, 25%, 60% and 90% value and only work with these 4. This will allow me to see how the shapes of the composition are arranged through simple values. So sometimes when you're doing this, one of the values that you have will not fit one of the values in the image. So a trick that you can do is squint your eyes and see what value that fits into best. If you're struggling with this, try and set up a grayscale version of the reference. So I like to try and make the process as simple as possible. In the next step, I'm going to move into the color study. So I start at the background and generally move forward. So I'm just roughing in the sky, and then I'll move into the rocks in front. So Wyatt has used these sort of saturated oranges, and that line in the rock is kind of a desaturated yellow green, but it looks kind of blue. So this is due to color relativity. Colors can appear different when, well, they appear different depending on the colors which surround them. So I continue into the shadow area and then move into the larger rock, paying close attention to all those hue shifts. This took a little bit longer because you just kind of have to build up the layers and keep kind of process of trial and error until you find the right colors that match your reference image. So I kind of paint in and then use my smudge brush just to smooth things out. So it's kind of a rinse and repeat process, and you get a nice painterly texture with this. So the shadow of the water will be on one layer and then the other 2 sections will be on a separate layer. I'll generally alpha lock these so I can paint within the confines of those. So next I move on to the foam. Again, I'm going to rough in the general shape, pulling and pushing the pixels around until I'm happy enough. Then I'll alpha lock that and start painting in sort of those warm hues and those sort of saturated purples and pinks. Again, trial and error until you find the colors. This can take a little bit of time if you're new to this, so try to be patient. And then up towards the light, that foam is going to get a little bit lighter. So once you're happy with the water, I move into the boat. Once I've blocked in the shape again, I will alpha lock the boat and start building up the shadows and the textures of the wood. So yeah, the boat is kind of these desaturated pinks and purples. Once I kind of suss that out, I start moving into the decals and the patterns on the side. Again, I'll use separate layers and try and break this down as much as possible just to make life easier for myself. And that way I can also edit these shapes if I need to distort them or warp them slightly. So I start adding a few highlights to the top of the boat just to make it stand out a bit more from the background. So the next step will be adding the character. So when I approached the character first, I just did that really rough sketch, but it wasn't really that accurate, so I need to readjust and recheck the proportions that I put down. So a handy little trick when doing this is try to use the environment and look at where the character falls in comparison to the objects in the environment. So I'm using the boat as a guideline. So the top of the boat just kind of lines up with his chest and it's near as the bottom of his head. So I'm using stuff like this as much as possible to help me with the proportions and where particular parts of his body fall. So I start with the head and then move down into the body and hands. And I just keep flipping my image and rechecking until I get close enough to the original. Again, it can be a slow process if you're new to this, so just be as patient as you can. This stuff just takes time to get a hang of. So there's quite a lot of hue shifts in the man's body. It goes from warms to cools. Even in the shadows, there's kind of these warm colours. It's really beautiful what Wyatt has done. So when I'm happy enough with the body of the man, I'm going to move on to the ore and place that on a layer beneath the man. So once I'm happy with the placement of the ore and the direction it's pointing, I move into the smaller details. So following this, I'm going to take an overall look at the image, see how it's going in comparison to my reference, do lots of kind of flipping and back and forth, see how it's going. So there's still a few smaller details to add, such as the reflection of the boat. So I'm going to take my boat layer, flip it upside down and duplicate it, and place it underneath my foam layer. I'm going to lower the opacity and distort it into place. So these will be all the main components of the image. So this would be a fine place to end the study. Once you find yourself getting caught up in kind of tertiary details, it's probably a good sign you should move on. But for the purpose of the study, I'm just going to show where you can go with it. So there's still a few small things that I'd like to fix, like there's a few of the shadows behind the man on the rock should be darker and some things should be softer, like the edges of the foam and a few details around the rocks. Again, the rocks on the left hand side were quite rough, so I just added a little bit more detail to those and a little bit more of a hue shift. Again, reflection on the water, I was missing those few little extra bits that make the rock kind of sit in place. So I'm just going around the foam, adding very slight extra bits of detail and softening out some of the edges where the foam breaks. So I'm also adding a few little, like I've added in some little pinks and purples to the foam just to really set that off. Just kind of remnants of this in Wyatt's piece, but I've exaggerated them a little bit. So don't be afraid to do this when you're doing your studies, to maybe exaggerate the colours slightly. You don't have to be totally true to it, but just do it within reason. So at the end of my studies, what I'll do is put everything, all my layers, into one folder. I will duplicate the folder and then compress that second folder. So that way I still have all my original layers just in case I need to go back and make some changes. But I'll now make the final adjustments to this compressed layer on top. So generally I'll add a subtle sharpen filter, maybe by like 20%, but it depends, because sometimes that can break the image, so you just have to judge it yourself. I'll also make the image maybe slightly brighter, and I'll add some maybe blues to the shadows and warms to the light. It all depends. So yeah, you just need to make those kind of calls depending on the lighting that you're dealing with. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this workshop, and until next time, thanks very much.